Many Board of Trustee members are already quite familiar with the principles of financial management for business. Still, the financial management of a higher education institution can pose very unique challenges that require some specialized understanding. The higher education sector has undergone drastic changes within the past decade, and we at SEF, along with CPA and Vice President of the Division of Finance and Administration at Ithaca College in New York, Gerald Hector, have developed this tutorial to lend some insight into those changes and suggestions for navigating these new financial waters. This tutorial will cover two sections: New Cost Structure Challenges for MSIs, Operating Effectively in the New Cost Structure. Section 1. New Cost Structure Challenges for MSIs. Serving on the board of any nonprofit organization has taken on added significance in recent years. There is greater accountability for trustees and for the overall mission and effectiveness of the institutions they have the ultimate fiduciary responsibility to maintain. Trustees are now awakening to the reality that they must have a greater understanding of the finances of the institutions they oversee. They cannot simply attend a one-day board training at their first meeting and fully understand all that is necessary to make wise and sound decisions around the financial health of the institution. Given the multifaceted nature of the revenue and expense elements of an institution, trustees now have to ask themselves the tough questions. Do I really understand the financial health of my institution and how the decisions of the board are affecting it? Financial exigency. Financial exigency is something that most higher education institutions want to avoid at all costs. It is the state an institution is in when it is unable to meet its financial obligations, thereby threatening the very existence of the school. Most individuals in the sector know of this looming challenge facing many institutions. Still, as evidenced by numerous headlines, financial exigency has even deeper impact on MSIs. For these institutions, financial exigency can all too easily lead down the path to financial ruin. The new normal. Throughout higher education, there are few challenges affecting institutions more than the inability of students and their parents to afford college. There was once a hope that the economy would one day return to pre-recession conditions and state funding to institutions would again increase, bringing much-needed relief to funding gaps. However, this does not seem to be the case, and students are finding it harder and harder to afford the rising cost of tuition. As a result, some institutions have engaged in a pattern of increased tuition discounting, but not always with a mind on the effect to their bottom line. This financial model is outdated, and a new normal has been established. Negative financial variables are solidifying, and in some instances, strengthening. The U.S. demographic is shifting, and the growing majority are the very students least able to afford college. All of the current indicators suggest that there will be permanent changes to the higher education cost structure, especially in regards to the traditional sources of revenue for institutions. This new normal poses particular challenges for MSIs. Parent Plus loan changes. The most obvious example of a cost structure change is the process that unfolded with the Parent Plus loan program, instituted by the Department of Education in the summer of 2012. The department changed the credit requirements for parents to receive these loans for their children, thereby disproportionately impacting MSIs who enroll a significant proportion of low-income, first-generation college students. As well-intentioned as the changes were, they had negative consequences that could have been foretold by MSI leaders had they been consulted. In the year following the Parent Plus loan changes, HBCU Parent Plus loan approvals decreased by 36%, resulting in a $150 million reduction in annual HBCU funding. Additionally, some estimate that HBCU enrollments have dropped by nearly 10%, with 38,000 students leaving campuses because of the Parent Plus loan changes. The Department of Education is currently enacting changes to the Parent Plus loan requirements that would add more flexibility to the credit standards and hopefully reverse some of the negative enrollment trends seen since the initial change in 2012. Classification. Net tuition revenue is the main source of income for a higher education institution that is heavily tuition dependent. The net tuition revenue and tuition discounting rates of a national sample of over 150 higher education institutions were reported in the 2014 Noel Levitt's Tuition Discounting Report. In the report, institutions were classified based on size and tuition level. Small colleges with low tuition were defined as colleges with a tuition and mandatory fee rate of less than $25,000 and enrollment of less than 850 full-time first-year students. Small colleges with high tuition were categorized as colleges with a tuition and mandatory fee rate of more than or equal to $25,000 and enrollment of less than 850 full-time first-year students. Most MSIs fall under one of either definition of small colleges with low tuition or small colleges with high tuition. Challenges for MSIs. In the absence of a large endowment, it is difficult for many MSIs to generate enough scholarship dollars to assist their students in enrolling each academic year. According to Noel Levitt's 2013 tuition discounting report, the average tuition discount rate for freshmen across the country for small colleges was 50.3%. It would be difficult for MSIs to raise their tuition discounting to this level without impacting the regular, ongoing operations of the institution. In addressing issues of institutional effectiveness and affordability, Board of Trustees will be challenged to utilize diverse skills that include financial creativity and social influence. Section 2. Operating effectively in the new cost structure. High tuition, high aid model. The cost of attendance at some private MSIs is above $20,000 per year, with variations based on brand recognition. The question is whether such price tags can be sustained when the primary demographics that enroll in these institutions are finding it increasingly harder to afford tuition. Although tuition discounting can have positive impacts on enrollment, boards need to refocus on net tuition revenue for balancing the operating budget and question the practice of rapidly raising the discount rate to simply maintain enrollment. Moving away from high tuition, high aid models is important for institutional effectiveness and also begins addressing the challenge of attracting students who are increasingly less likely to afford college. Dropping the tuition sticker price and reducing the amount of aid provided by the institution can create an illusion that a college or university is cheaper to attend, thereby capturing the attention of a wider breadth of low-income students, though the out-of-pocket payments might be exactly the same in some instances. Tuition modeling. Tuition modeling is a broad concept intended to ensure institutions achieve positive net tuition revenue by examining key cost and revenue variables over an extended period of time. Tuition modeling requires institutions to take into account variables such as full-time equivalents, tuition discounting, annual tuition, government loan programs, and the overall economic climate. The combination of these variables is then modeled over a 5 to 10-year period to determine the true value of the net tuition revenue. Having an understanding of the net tuition revenue is also important to providing an accurate understanding of the cost per degree. This information can provide Board of Trustee members with an understanding of which programs and departments are generating revenue, which is key to financial planning for the institution. Net tuition revenue. The total gross revenue an institution will collect from tuition and fees, minus institutional aid provided to students in the form of scholarships. It is typically the largest source of revenue for the budget balancing purposes of an institution. Fundraising. The Great Recession of 2008 to 2009 exposed just how reliant institutions of higher education were, and still are, on fundraising. These institutions need unrestricted sources of revenue, or targeted endowments and annual gifts to augment budgets. Fundraising efforts must follow a hierarchical structure, with unrestricted dollars being the main source of all efforts. Capital campaigns or comprehensive campaigns are great. However, with the shift in donor preferences to restricted giving, restricted funds do not have the same impact as unrestricted giving. Endowment support is the bottom fundraising source in the hierarchical structure. Though it is restricted in nature, it funds the institution's operations, which in turn impacts the students and staff. Scholarship support is second in importance. It allows an institution to prop up its institutional aid offerings. Though it lacks the freedom of the unrestricted gifts, it has an immediate impact on enrollment, which affects the net tuition revenue of the campus. Unrestricted gifts are at the top of the hierarchy, those that can be used for everything from plant upkeep to institutional aid. Fundraising efforts should also be tied into a formal strategic plan. Some gifts, oftentimes restricted in nature, have strings attached that burden institutions with expectations years beyond the original financial gift. Financial responsibility test. The Department of Education has annual financial standards that must be met in order for higher education institutions to remain in the Title IV loan programs they offer. Those standards are captured in what the Department of Education calls its Annual Financial Responsibility Test. To pass the annual test, colleges and universities have to attain a composite financial index of a minimum of 1.5 points. Simply put, failing the test signals to prospective students that their attendance at a college or university might be at risk. If the institution is not allowed to participate in the Title IV program, it will likely be unable to offer institutional aid, and the student's ability to afford tuition will be severely diminished. The Department of Education has provided for some flexibility by way of ranges, but the ultimate goal is to get above the 1.5 points minimum threshold. The criteria are as follows. Attain a 1.5 and the institution passes the test for the most recently completed fiscal year. Typically, no action is taken by the Department of Education. Attain between a 1.0 and 1.5, and the institution may be subject to some form of adverse action, which could potentially mean being placed on reimbursement. That means the institution will have to provide evidence of funds needed, and the Department of Education will then reimburse those amounts after evidence of expenditure is presented. This development is a slippery slope causing cash flow concerns, especially at smaller institutions where cash flows and operating margins are small. Below a 1.0, and the institution faces the possibility of not being allowed to continue in the Title IV program. Net tuition calculations. Let's look at a few examples of net tuition calculations. In this image, we see a snapshot of an imaginary campus's basic financial outlook. Notice that net tuition revenue decreases for this institution from 2014 through 2017, as the amount of gross tuition revenue fails to compensate for the increased institutional aid. We will now look at 3 imaginary campuses, each faced with a major economic challenge, and how they respond to that challenge. These examples are meant to serve as a guide as to how responsible and forward-thinking financial management can help an institution respond to financial exigency. In each case, net tuition revenue is an integral aspect of proper planning. It is important to note the assumptions made in each case, and that the composite financial index scores provided are only a loose approximation used for effect, and not an actual calculation based on the figures. Institution A. In this image, we see a snapshot of Institution A's net tuition calculation. Financial challenges. This institution's students face challenges being able to afford tuition. In order to maintain enrollment, the board, president, and senior leaders decide to provide unfunded discounted aid. Although gross tuition and fees are increasing at a rate of 3%, tuition discounting is growing at a faster rate. Therefore, net tuition revenue is decreasing year over year, and its unrestricted fundraising efforts are lackluster. Operating expenses were not decreased, thereby forcing the institution into deficit spending. The board, president, and senior leaders should have found ways to obtain alternate sources of revenue, such as fundraising to plug the gap, or reduce the size of the operating budget. Decisions. The decision was made to continue with the current spending levels, utilizing cash reserves to meet payments, and work on fixing the enrollment issues prospectively. Results. The institution is now engaging in consistent deficit spending, and as a result, may be unable to reverse the need to discount its aid. Notice that despite a bump in enrollment due to increased discounting, the net tuition revenue continues to drop. The institution has set itself on a path to financial instability and will likely suffer from fits and starts in its annual operations as it cannot produce positive net tuition revenue. Worse still, the institution's composite financial index score has remained below 1.0, putting them in danger of losing Title IV inclusion. Institution B. In this image, we see a snapshot of Institution B's net tuition calculation. Financial challenges? The students at this institution suffered a significant disruption in their lives economically, and they collectively had a difficult time making payments. In order to keep the students, the institution increased its discount rate in fiscal year 2015 through 2016 to maintain its enrollment. The inflationary increase in expenses of 3% would have caused it to have insufficient funds to cover its operations for the annual revenues. Decisions. The board, in conjunction with the president and the chief business officer, adopted a plan to reduce expenses in a strategic manner. the plan acknowledged that net tuition revenue was positive, but was insufficient to balance the budget. Targeted reductions, not across the board, were made in expense categories that did not impact the instruction and academic support sections of the budget. In effect, the decision was taken to reduce public service and institutional support to compensate for the shortfall. All student-related costs were maintained. In the 2016 through 2017 fiscal year, the board, president, and CFO decided to cap the tuition discounting to a dollar amount at $6.5 million. Results. That decision allowed the institution to focus on the students it attracts, increasing enrollment overall and leading to positive net tuition revenue growth. A 5-year model might not work for this institution because of the demographic it serves, but it underscores the partnership established between the board, president, and senior administrators, a model from which future decisions can and should be made. Institution C. In this image, we see a snapshot of Institution C's net tuition calculation. Financial challenges. This institution, through proper planning, forecasted that an enrollment challenge was on the horizon. Notice the drop in enrollment from 2014 through 2016. Decisions. The board, president, and senior administrators strategically put in place a plan that had as its tenets: 1. Unfunded institutional aid would only grow by $500,000 per year. 2. The discounting percentage should not exceed 30% within the 3-year planning period. 3. If there were any shortfalls due to net tuition revenue being flat or declining, the first approach would be to find alternate sources of revenue via fundraising or auxiliary services. If unsuccessful, strategic and targeted cost reductions would be employed to bring the budget into balance. Results. The plan was executed flawlessly. Though net tuition revenue fell in 2015 through 2016, unrestricted funding increases and cost reductions still led to an increase in net assets for the institution to report in its annual financial statements. Now that you are focused on which factors to keep in mind on the balance sheet, here are a series of practical steps that can be followed to promote responsible financial management of the institution. Create an enrollment strategy that takes into consideration both the changing demographics in the United States and the ability of the students to pay. Hire qualified and experienced business analysts into the enrollment management group. Understand the operating cash flow needs of the college to assist with shaping the institutional aid programs. Engage with fundraising consultants who can assist with market analysis to establish fundraising benchmarks for annual goals and capital campaign goals. Create a timeline for board review of the financial and OMB A-133 audits and the IRS Form 990. Train the institutional advancement staff so they understand the hierarchical needs of fundraising and how they can work in tandem with the budget office to manage both expectations and results. Engage with seasoned financial officers from the higher education sphere to conduct training workshops for the Board of Trustees and the administration. Lastly, at the beginning of the year, review cash flow projections that highlight unrestricted and restricted sources. For greater detail on these steps, see the report Navigating the New Normal. Higher education institutions are rather resilient, and they have come through some tough times before. With so many variables leading to the logical conclusion that there is a new normal for higher education, finding the right mix of variables to sustain an institution is going to require a tremendous amount of work. It falls directly at the feet of the leaders of these institutions, the trustees, working with the president to complete that work.